Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Peace Islands New York event. Good to have you all with us. If you're a first-time visitor, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You will also have the opportunities to ask questions in the chat box to the right of this YouTube presentation. I welcome our guests to this event today, and the event is titled The Challenges of Hate, Asian, Muslim, and Jewish Perspectives. We have today who's running late currently, the New York State Assemblymember Yuh-Line Niou. She'll be joining us shortly. And the other speaker speaking on the Muslim perspective is Dr. Daniel Hummel, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Louisiana, Monroe, and Deborah Lauter, who was appointed as the first executive director of the New York City Office for the Prevention of Hate Crimes. So I welcome Dr. Daniel Hummel to take the microphone. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen. So let me see if this will work without any issues. So can you see that? All right, great. So I'm going to also keep time on my end so that I don't go over. All right, so thank you for that wonderful introduction. And as you stated, I am assistant professor of political science and public administration at the University of Louisiana, Monroe. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that I put in, research on, particularly a book that I published on the spread of anti-Sharia laws in the United States, and just kind of generally Islamophobia. And before I get into that, though, I'm going to spend some time explaining a little bit why I became interested in this topic. And it really goes back to 2010. So I was getting my PhD in Florida. And we probably, if you're old enough to remember, as you remember, a lot of my students were very young. And I have to keep reminding myself about that. I'm like, oh, do you remember in 2010? They're like, I was like 9. In 2010, there was the Ground Zero mosque controversy. There was a lot of fallout that came from that. In particular, a lot of mosque protests across the country that kind of ignited out of the Ground Zero mosque controversy in New York City. We saw some of the first anti-Sharia laws at the time, basically trying to forbid Sharia in the court systems in the United States, as if there was a problem with that. At the time, I was also living in Allen West Congressional District in South Florida. So I don't think if you know who Allen West was, I actually was in his congressional district. He was a one-term representative. Joe Kaufman actually tried to get my friend, Dr. El-Halabi at FAU fired, making bogus claims of material support for terrorism. There was just a whole lot of things, pipe bombings at mosques, the burning down of mosques, the Quran burning, all of this kind of happened within a few years. I realized at that point, after 2010, that this is something I needed to spend some time doing some research on and get involved with. I mean, this is not something that's in the past also, right? Last October, we had another mosque burnt in Tacoma. There was an incident in New Jersey where a young girl wearing hijab had it forcibly removed by a teacher. And there's things that have happened since then. It's just that's when I put this PowerPoint together. These were the big issues at the time. So it's not something in the past. It's something that Muslims are dealing with to this day. Of course, we've seen the FBI hate crime statistics recently released that show that we are at a record high of hate crimes recorded in the last 2 decades, which to me just makes me sick to my stomach. Where things are going, and it's so disappointing, and it just makes me wonder, what next year will hold and the year after that. And I really hope that things can get turned around, but at this stage, things seem to be getting worse and worse. So clearly, the issue, it's in your face. These are my pictures, actually. I took these pictures of people that were standing in front of me. That little head there at the bottom, that's my son's head. This man wearing the shirt, so it's in your face. Clearly, it's very prevalent everywhere you go, and it's not going away. It's, you know, the one picture on the right there, I always like to show this. It's like xenophobia, ignorance, racism, hatred, and violence, they're all connected with each other. And that's what I got from that political cartoon, and it just doesn't seem to get any better. And so really, you know, what I ultimately felt like since 2010, people must speak out. We must hold people accountable. However, I'm also somebody who believes that, you know, all of us have good in us. And I always try to put myself in a position to appeal to that good. So these are some things like, for instance, I was in one of the 5 world parliaments of religion. It's unbelievable. There's only been 5 of them since the late 19th century. The last one was in Toronto. On the left-hand side, that's actually Dr. Saleh Sabanati, who is a professor at Middle Tennessee. And he was involved with the Murfreesboro Mosque controversy when in Murfreesboro, they basically protested, burnt down the mosque several times, they attacked the mosque several times when they were just trying to build a mosque with a community center for their community that had been growing since the 1990s. It was unbelievable. And I'm actually standing in that finished mosque. It's just really an emotional moment, actually. So, you know, to confront something, really, we have to understand it. And so that's what I always tell my students, actually, is many of them also feel kind of the same way I do. And we look at statistics like on hate crimes and things like that, and we go, boy, you know, things are really getting out of hand. And, you know, so I say, well, we got to understand something to confront it. We must confront it, though. Silence, and someone said this to me today, silence is complicity. If we are silent about these crimes, if we're silent about, and it's not just crimes on Muslims and on the Jewish community, on the Asian community, on the African-American community, on the Latinx community, on any community, then we are complicit in those continuous crimes. So I went ahead and I said, okay, I need to understand this more. And so I went ahead and I spent a couple of years just doing research on the spread of anti-Sharia laws. I really want to understand what the dynamic going on here. Why were these states passing these laws, and who was passing them, and what was kind of the underlying the currents that were going on that were making people want to even introduce these into these state legislatures. I mean, and you'll see some of the text of these laws, which are really, it's hard to imagine in a country that says one of our founding principles is the freedom of religion, trying to ban the practice of a religion. Like it's too contradictory to even wrap your head around it, right? So just to kind of introduce what is Sharia, right? So Sharia is a branch of Islamic law derived from the Quran, and Sunnah. Sunnah is the practice of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It's applied across the Islamic world with different interpretations. However, usually when people are thinking about some of the rules and regulations, they're actually thinking about fiqh, and that's a little bit different, right? So some people in this country believe that Islamic law is creeping into American courtrooms. You know, civil court cases relate to inheritance, family issues, stuff like that. They claim that Dearborn has Sharia law. No, it does not. I've been there many times to talk about Dearborn, Michigan. Dearborn just has a lot of Arabs, but there's no Sharia law there. And this whole idea that Islam versus the West is silent jihad and all of that, right? And so really the anti-Sharia movement, if you can kind of wrap, you know, like a couple of quotes around it, this is basically the best quotes I could find. It's basically capitalizing on any Muslim prejudice and discrimination, and, you know, basically capitalizing on discrimination or ignorance of Islam to basically push these laws through these state legislatures and get them passed into law. So here's an example of just how crazy these laws can get. So this one was actually introduced in Tennessee in 2011, basically allowed the state to determine whether or not some organization in the state was actually a Sharia supporter. And then if it was considered a Sharia supporter, so this could be a mosque, an Islamic school or whatever, then that organization could be fined. And at the worst, those that are supporting the implementation of Sharia could face a punishment up to 15 years in jail. This was a law introduced in Tennessee. And so they've toned down the law since this Tennessee law that was introduced in 2011. But they're still out there, right? They're still being introduced, and the intent of the law is the same. Many times they can't conflict the state constitution, they can't conflict with the federal or US Constitution, but they find ways to change the language in order to continue to disparage the Muslim community, make a statement, I suppose, while at the same time realizing that many of these laws are just symbolic because they can't really be applied, but not all of them, right? Here's an example. So in Kansas, which has an anti-Sharia law, this is really interesting. So I was talking to Isma-Uddin, who is a scholar on religious freedom of religion law in the United States. She shared the story of Elham Soleimani, who filed for divorce from her abusive husband in 2012 in Kansas. So she entered into a marriage contract of her husband based on the rules of Islam, so Sharia, in which her husband owed her 1,354 gold coins, basically the equivalent of $600,000 upon divorce. But the judge in the court could not enforce this contract because it was Sharia. So, lucky for her abusive husband, I suppose, he never had to pay her a dime and they got divorced because of the foreign law ban. So it just goes to show you just how this ends up hurting people, not helping anyway. They think that Sharia is somehow creeping into our court systems. So I really wanted to know, what were these significant factors that were going into the adoption of these Sharia laws, the anti-Sharia laws. And I'm going to have some statistics, but I'm going to go right through that because if no one's interested in that, I'm just going to keep on cruising. But essentially, I was interested on, basically the survival time. How did these laws end up getting introduced? And then how long did it take for them to go from being a bill to a law, and whether or not they actually made it through that process and became law, and what were the factors that led to it becoming law in the states. So I was looking from 2010 and 2019 when I had the data for it. These are the states that have enacted these laws. So you might be noticing a trend here, right here in my neck of the woods: Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee. All of these states have all enacted anti-Sharia laws. So we're talking mostly in the Bible Belt in the southern states. So you kind of see a trend already, but again, it's not one thing to be anecdotal and say, well, I see a trend, but you have to actually get into it and take a look at the data, which is something that involves a lot more work. The one beneficial thing that's come out of this research is that the number of introductions of these laws have come down. So at least there is some sanity returning to some of these state legislatures that are realizing that this is a clear violation of our constitutions and that we cannot have laws that ban a particular religion and the practices in that religion. But still, these laws are on the books in many states, as you saw on the last slide. In any case, these were the variables that I looked at. I was interested in bill introduction, years of passage, passed or not. And I was looking at these variables, whether or not the evangelical presence, Muslim presence, ideological distance, conservative, liberals, whether or not it had something to do with the legislature itself or religiosity and how people practiced their religion, how religious people were, and also the presence of anti-Muslim hate groups. So as you know, Southern Poverty Law Center actually had to create a special designation for anti-Muslim hate groups because they've grown so much over the years that they have to create a special designation for them. And so, again, I said these are statistics. I'm just going to cruise right through this. But one of the things you take away from this slide is that there was clearly a close relationship between religiosity, ideology, evangelicalism, and where it was located, the neighbors, right? We're talking about the states in the South. And also there was a negative relationship with education. And you're going to see that in these results, is that education, the better the people are educated in a state, the less likely that these laws are even going to be introduced or considered, and certainly not passed in these state legislatures because they realize that it's ridiculous, right? So I did a couple of regressions. One was for the number of bills introduced, the other one was for whether it passed or not. And I kind of got the same results, right? You kind of see, how ideology and religion really is what bolstered these bills through these state legislatures, what got them through these state legislatures, and what ultimately got them to be passed in the state legislatures, right? So if these states were less religious, if they had fewer evangelicals, and you'll see this in my takeaways here, then you're going to see that they didn't have or didn't even introduce these laws, right? So these are my takeaways from my analysis. Religious salience, huge factor. How important religion is to people really is what pushes these laws through these state legislatures. Ideology, conservative states, evangelical states, predominantly evangelical states, states in a particular region, particularly in the South, particularly where I'm located in Louisiana, Mississippi, and higher education states tend to not have these bills be passed as much. Presence of any Muslim hate groups also got these laws introduced. So there was a lot of lobbying on the part of these anti-Muslim hate groups. So I got about a minute and a half. So these are where I say, what can we do? Well, first off, I really believe that interfaith is a must. People don't come in contact with Muslims enough. They really, really don't. People of faith, this is my picture actually. I caught a really cool moment, right? People of different faiths looking at this poster about Islam. Even if you're an absolutist and believe that religion is the only correct one, right? Blessed are the peacemakers, right? Matthew 5:9. Come on, right? We should be aiming for that. And mutual respect really goes a long way. I took this picture in a library or in a bookstore, I should say, where the Quran was put right next to the Devil's Dictionary, right? As if the Devil's Dictionary or the Necronomicon is somehow equivalent with the Quran, and therefore they need to be placed next to each other. These small things matter, right? Every good deed is a charity. In Sunnah al-Tirmidhi, 1970, it basically says even the smallest things, right, can make a huge difference. People need to stop talking about Muslims in the same context as discussions of national security or patriotism. I'm getting tired of it. People need to stop talking about the Islamic world as an antithesis to everything in the West. It's that type of discussion, that type of dialogue is what causes people to disparage Muslims, the Muslim community, and leads to things like the Anti-Sharia laws. So 15 minutes, I got it.
Well done. Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Hummel. I'm going to now pass the microphone. The floor is yours, Deborah. We're still waiting on the Assemblymember, just FYI to our audience and the other speakers. The Assemblymember is running late, but the floor is yours, Deborah. Thank you very much. And I should just remind people again, to the right of the YouTube screen there, you have the chat box. So please use that to ask your questions. I will be posing your questions to the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emre, and it's a pleasure to join tonight. Daniel, your presentation was fantastic. You covered an amazing amount of information in a very short time. It's interesting. You started off with the silence is complicity, and I prepared to start my presentation with an Elie Wiesel quote along the same lines. Those of you who know, I'm sure Elie Wiesel was a survivor and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And he said, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And so I'm always delighted when people sponsor these programs. So thank you, Emre, for putting this on. And for those of you joining, you're obviously not indifferent to what's going on. And so it's really important. And that's where I find a lot of comfort in what is really a very difficult time right now. I don't know how many of you saw my bio. I am currently the executive director of the New York City Office for the Prevention of Hate Crimes. I want to tell you a little about it because I think it's really extraordinary and an important thing to understand. Daniel presented sort of the academic piece. I'll tell you what government does in this sphere, and it's New York City, I think, is quite unusual. In 2018, 2019, we saw the numbers of hate crimes starting to go up in New York City. And generally what you want is government leaders and community leaders to stand up and decry the event and make sure there's a strong statement. Incredibly important that leadership does that. But our city council and then mayor said, we're going to do something more. We are going to create this office that's going to take a long-term holistic approach to preventing hate violence. So I had been at the Anti-Defamation League, which is a Jewish civil rights organization that fights hate against all, for 18 years. I had taken a break for a bit and basically applied for the job and got it. It's my first foray into government, city government. And I launched the office. It's been 2.5 years now. And as I said, we're really looking at holistic long-term approaches. So over the past 2.5 years, what I did is put together what I call an interagency committee on hate. I looked at all the different stakeholders of city agencies. So clearly, New York Police Department is at the table. the Department of Education, the City Commission on Human Rights, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, 20 different, or the Taxi Limousine Commission. I had to learn all the acronyms of these, which was a challenge, but a really good group, about 20 of us. And then all the district attorney offices, we have 5 boroughs here, they all have hate crime units. So we convene them to look at strategic approaches, to share information, to see where the gaps are and how we can do better. At the same time, we started looking at who are all the populations that are most vulnerable to hate violence. So clearly, as you just heard some of the statistics from Daniel, the Muslim community, the Jewish community, the Asian community, the LGBTQ community, Black community, and Hispanic. Those would be the lead. And those mirror the groups that are protected by civil rights laws and by hate crime laws across the country. It's usually race, religion, national origin, disability, age defined as over 60, gender identity, sexual orientation. So these laws are incredibly important. And when you hear the statistics, like what Daniel said, that the numbers are alarming and they can be depressing, I like to look at the silver lining of those. It means we have laws that care about protecting these vulnerable communities, and our government is keeping track of it and trying to do something about it. So there's a paradox in the numbers. You know, when Yuh-Line comes on, Assemblymember, we can talk about it. But if I see no community reporting their incidents, there's a problem there. That shows there's a lack of trust between that community and police department. They don't want to report for various reasons. When you see the numbers go up, incidents are happening, but there is more faith that our government's going to do something about it and be there for us. So when I see the numbers go up, I'm like, okay, well, we know what the problem is. We're doing something, but the community's coming forward to report. So it's one of those things that we deal with that, you know, you're going to get the headlines like, oh my God, New York City has, 100% increase in hate crimes. But at the same time, a lot of those things were happening and the communities just didn't report in the past, particularly the Asian community. When I look at the numbers from 2019, there was 1 reported anti-Asian hate crime. We know that that's not accurate. And so today you see a huge jump. So I work with these most vulnerable communities. We bring them together. I thought it would be amazing. Some of them are getting city money to do hate violence prevention. I wanted to bring them all together to share their best practices and their challenges. What are we doing wrong, right? And then my office serves as a bridge between those communities and government agencies. So as I said, we're looking at the long-term, how to fix things. And how do you do that, right? How do you stop this hate? That's what everyone wants to we all want it to just stop, right? And listen, there's no one way to do it. And I've learned this over all my years at ADL and doing this work. There's just not one way. You have to take a comprehensive approach. The way I use a strategic intersectional approach, and that's you need education, you need strong community relations, and you need the laws and the law enforcement mechanisms, and they all intertwine, right? So, a perfect example is what Daniel mentioned in his work. The higher the education level, the lower the number of bias events and whatnot. That's critically important. And not only just the education level, but what are people being taught? So my office, for example, is tasked with creating a hate crime curriculum. We're focusing on middle and high school students. We want to teach them not just about what hate crimes are and what's happened historically, but really give them skills of empathy and understanding and not toleration, but respect for others. That's a long-term project we got going on. I was asked to speak at a Brooklyn high school in a neighborhood that was experiencing a lot of hate crimes. And we went and the kids were like, you make us learn math and science and English, but you don't give us the tools to learn how to respect. And I'm like, yeah, this is exactly what we want to hear. We can do this. And then this other girl raises her hand and she goes, yeah, well, you can teach us, but we go home and you should hear what's coming out of our parents' mouths. And that is true. Kids learn what they, live what they learn from their home environment. So we're living in this period right now of I would call it a breakdown in civility. You are bombarded with screaming voices in civil. The dialogues are not what they used to be. I will say the lid has come off the sewer in terms of what has flowed in this country. I will say, I'm not acting in a partisan way, but there can be no doubt that the Trump administration during his period unleashed bigoted, racist views and normalized it, made it easy for people to do it. It's always been there. It's always been there. From the Jewish perspective, when we look at how do you know if anti-Semitism's better or worse in this country? When I was at ADL, there were two ways to look at it. There was we did attitudinal surveys, right? You could find out who bought into stereotypes of Jews, and you look at the incidents, the number of incidents. Are they going up? Are they going down? Those two factors are incredibly important. I don't know if the surveys have changed. I haven't seen recent ones, but they usually in the surveys, about 12% of Americans, we would say, held firmly anti-Semitic views. And I would say that was probably true. If you were bigoted against Jews, you were probably bigoted against Muslims and others, right? The laws that Daniel's talking about, the anti-Sharia laws, as he said, those are the same legislatures that are also looking at anti-trans laws, anti-abortion laws. I mean, there's a real pattern to what's going on. There's an agenda there. So we have a lot of these challenges. In Emre's description of this panel, he was like, the question was, how are these communities reacting to these current spikes in hate speech and hate crimes? I can tell you one word: fear. I have never, in all my years doing this work, seen such a high fear level. We have Asian families, Asian seniors who have not left their apartments in 2 years. A combination of COVID, but a combination of the violent attacks that's going on. Now, my office, again, we focus on the hate crime aspects, but there have been these high-profile incidents, most recently this week, the murder of Christina Lee. And even though it may or may not have been deemed a hate crime, I think the detectives are still working on that, the fear level is beyond anything reasonable. And so there are enormous problems. Hate crimes can be motivated, and some of these crimes by people who do hold biases, but what we're seeing now is this real pattern of a perpetration by people who are mentally ill, who some of them are homeless. Not all homeless people have mental illness, and not all mental illness results in violence by any means. But there is clearly something going on during this COVID period where social services have cut back, and we see this escalation of violent attacks. So the fear is clearly there. I would say anger. People want more. When I go and I talk about all the good work my office has been doing in creating resources to support the Jewish community, the Asian community, and all the education materials we're doing, it's not satisfying. They want immediate action. They want the violence to stop. And often what that means to some people is they want a law enforcement response. They want more patrols and whatnot. Now that gets interesting from a community relations point of view, because in the Black community, many of them don't want a greater police presence in their neighborhoods, right? So we have all these different things going on, and finding the right balance of having security and safety at the same time as respect for all. There's confusion. I think people are just, we're in this period of instability. There's a lot of confusion. And I'd say sadness. People are just feeling down and depressed and want to get out of this. So, the answer is, people kind of taking on and caring about each other, doing the kind of relationships between Muslims and Jews and Christians. I lived in Atlanta for 16 years, and we had some amazing programs of bringing Christian, Muslims, Jews together. We actually traveled for a couple weeks to Turkey together, and they would mix us up in different hotel arrangements, only by gender, but so I would be, me being in the Jewish camp would be rooming with Muslim women, and you realize real quickly that we all snore alike, right? Just breaking down the stereotypes between people is incredibly important. New York is so incredibly diverse. We always brag about all the number of languages we speak, but what I will tell you, there is not as much interaction and understanding of each other as there should be. And so we're looking at how can we create more programs to get people to dialogue, to get to know each other, to bring down those stereotypes. Again, not just the kids, but the adults as well. So I'm looking at the time. I think I'm probably close, Emery. Those are sort of my broad strokes about how we're dealing.
2 more minutes if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've covered. I'd be curious to hear the questions from others. I don't know if Yuh-Line's on yet. I can't tell from my screen.
She's running a bit late. My name is Lauter. I'm her chief of staff. I was asked to advance her for a little bit here.
Good to see you. We've been doing a lot of work. I don't know if you were on when I was talking about the frustration in the community and being there for each other. So I'm trying to think what else would be helpful for this group to know. One of the other challenges is, and that has shifted over my years of doing this, is the online hate. So, for example, when Daniel mentions the hate groups, I actually used to oversee at ADL the Center on Extremism as well as the Civil Rights Department. Much of the ideology that used to be like you could have a Klan group and they would go leaflet at homes and spread their hate ideology against these groups. Today they just post it online and it's shared much more widely and can influence enormous numbers of people in a very quick and dangerous way, I believe. So getting a handle on hate online is one of the challenges. I'm sure many of you are watching, Facebook challenges and how they're dealing with this, but this is something that clearly needs the attention from lawmakers. We always used to feel that there shouldn't be regulation for some of these the web groups, but not so sure. I think something needs to be done to rail in, and I think Facebook's acknowledging that they have some major problems and are going to address it. But that I think has greatly contributed to the flow of racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism online, and it inspires others. So even if they're not members of hate groups, they're sitting behind their computers, they're ingesting it. Many of the perpetrators of these crimes in the Jewish community, we know from the Poe wave, from Tree of Life, from the recent hostage situation, people are radicalized online, and it's hurting all of us. So the answer is a lot of us have to stand up for the other. The Jewish community needs to stand up for the Asian community. The Asian community needs to stand up for the Jewish community. The Muslims need to stand for the Asian. The Blacks need to stand up for, we all have to be in this together. Those voices have to be elevated in a significant way. And so the good folks will win. So again, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And so all of us really have to be invested, whether it's just, if you're just an individual, the way you talk to your kids, the way you speak, the way you interact with your school. Are they teaching correct history, right? Are they teaching about the consequences of hate? Are they teaching Asian American history? So, one of the things my office did was we paired the Asian American Education Foundation with our Department of Education. They're doing teacher training now on Asian history, and that's going to be sort of a year-round thing. They're looking at all these different voices and really making our kids much more culturally competent to live in this world. So I see a lot of optimism. You feel the pain and the pressure of what's been going on in society today, but there's so much optimism from people who really understand the importance of standing up for each other and doing these kinds of programs that will wake people up and get people involved. So that's my 15 minutes, Emery, I think.
Very good, thank you. Lawrence, do we have an update regarding Assembly members joining us?
She is in conference right now, I think, for the session, so I don't have an update for her. She's not really allowed to use her phone at this time, so it ends when it ends.
Okay.
I'm happy to talk about anything you're curious about. I'm very familiar with her platform and all of this stuff.
Okay, by all means, then the floor is yours. If you can talk about the recent spike in
Sure.
hate crimes and the challenges of hate regarding, the Asian community. We've had a Muslim speaker, we've had a Jewish speaker, so please,
Sure,
the Asian American perspective is important.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think specifically for our district, we have a very interesting district. We have a very large population of Asian Americans, and we have a very large population of Jewish individuals as well. So in our district, we've experienced a lot of hate in various different outlets. For example, the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, is actually within our district as well. And I think it was right after the January attacks, a flag, a Confederate flag, was tied to one of the train cars that transported Jewish prisoners to, I think, the largest Nazi death camp, Camp Auschwitz. And it was like the day after those attacks happened. And as we all know, like, the Confederate flag has really been adopted as a symbol for white supremacy and white nationalism by extremist terrorist groups. And I think domestic terrorists, they carried similar flags and came upon our nation's capital right a few days around before that attack occurred. And even at the Capitol attack, people could be heard seen wearing T-shirts that read like Camp Auschwitz, or chanting anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim slogans. And I mean, like, the placing the flag was clear. It was meant to traumatize a community that's already experienced, like, the agony and trauma of one of the most horrific atrocities in history. On that same front, like, we've had various synagogues and Jewish small businesses and other areas in our district plagued by, I guess, graffiti or just flyers or anti-Semitic flyers. And the same thing has really happened to the Asian American community as well in recent times. Like, we've seen one of the largest spikes in hate crimes throughout our district and in New York City as well. Even for our own staff and our interns, we've experienced it. The Assemblymember has experienced it as well. We've been told to go back to China to go eat some more bats after frying them in the wok, or, some of us are just told to go simply die. And it's not something that's, and I think the most worrisome part of this, and like, I think the thing I want to stress is the humanizing aspect. A lot of these things in previous years before the pandemic were focused on property. It was crimes against property, graffiti, flyering, and it was verbal. And now we're seeing incidents in violent hate crimes. Like, there recently, Christina Lee as well. That was probably one of the most violent. It was in our district. It was probably one of the most violent ones that we've seen in a very long time. But it's not just on that scale as well. Like, there's various assaults, and these are only the ones that are actually reported from our constituents and from individuals. And that's another thing that's really important, where it's hard to tell how large of a sprawling, deep-rooted problem this is when people are self-selecting out and not wanting to access the government because they're either scared or they feel like there's no point. A lot of issues arise when people aren't reporting the, I guess, crimes that are being committed against them. And I think there was a lot of good points raised so far, and we know that policy changes alone won't really be enough. Like, of course, we need to fix our broken housing system, provide mental health services or social services, address poverty, or distribute equitable funding to communities of color. These are all, like, incredibly important steps to really bridging that gap and bridging and breaking that narrative of what's going on here. But at the same time, every New Yorker and every American really has a role to play and making clear that this is not who we are as people, and acts of violence and hatred cannot and will not be tolerated. Being indifferent is very much the way that we come towards circumstances of what we're seeing right now. And it's systemic and historical issues that kind of bleed through to everybody's own perceptions as well as indifference. And the more it becomes a statistic and the less it becomes human, the more incidents like these will arise. And I think we have to be collaborative and have conversations across all communities of color and basically show the message that we stand united against all forms of hate against anyone. And I think I'll close off by kind of saying one of the most, I guess, alienating aspects of all of this is that there's been a lot of communities of colors that haven't really, I guess, had the time or the opportunity or the circumstances to kind of talk across each other. And this is like one of these conversations that we're having. And it's one of the most important ones that we can have about how we can help and how we can figure things out and how we can kind of spread a better message for everybody to stand behind. And this is something that needs to apply across all communities of colors, because unfortunately, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-Asian, these are not the only groups that are being affected. We've seen the most spike, but it does come down to a cross-community conversation that must be had very, very soon. I'm happy to take any questions or concerns that you might have, or anything specific about anything I talked about that might be interesting.
Yeah, if I could comment on
Please,
something
Deborah.
that Lawrence said. Yeah, I mean, it's, this is the challenge of democracy. You have the right to be a bigot in this country, right? You have the right to spew racist, disgusting, anti-Semitic stuff. There's a lot of misunderstanding about hate crimes. If somebody yells, I hate Chinese people, that's protected speech. But if they go up and they say, I hate Chinese people and I'm going to punch you in the mouth, that's a threat, an actionable threat, and it can be an aggravated harassment charge. But what we're seeing is so many of these, I wouldn't even call them microaggressions anymore. These are macroaggressions that we're seeing a lot of, and it's pumping up, a lot of the advocacy organizations will keep track of those, but they're not hate crimes. So you're not seeing the whole picture with just the hate crime numbers. I was interested, the anecdote that Lawrence told about the Confederate flag, that traditionally would be considered protected speech, right? Putting that flag on that train. Maybe there was something that vandalism could be stretched, but the reaction was so visceral, and people got up and they said, we need to do something about this. This Confederate flag is a hate symbol. And New York, actually, I think the governor signed a new law that adds the posting of a Confederate flag with the intent to intimidate as under the penal code. So the hanging of nooses, the drawing of swastikas, and the Confederate symbol now. The numbers in the anti-Semitic category, about 60 to 70% of the anti-Semitic incidents in New York City are driven by the swastika incidents. The numbers of the violent attacks against Jews is not that high. Conversely, the hate crimes against the Asian community are driven by violence, by the actual attacks. So we have to find different ways of handling those kinds of issues.
Any other comments from the speakers? I have a question. What are practical ways, Deborah, Daniel, and Lawrence, particularly for the average American that is incensed by what's happening, whether it be hate speech or actually a hate crime, how can they practically get involved with community members in their neighborhood, or if they're incensed with something happening in Manhattan or Queens or somewhere that's outside of their usual comfort zone, but they see it happening often? What are practical steps you feel people can be doing in their own towns and cities? Daniel, maybe would you like to take this, and I'll offer the microphone to everybody.
I was gonna wait and see if someone else had, because I'm actually
Deborah,
take notes on
Lawrence?
that. But yeah,
Sure, I'm happy to start. I think it comes down to, I guess, what you're comfortable with, right? For example, in our district, we now have neighborhood watches, that's community-led organizations that basically just go around and patrol the neighborhood. And they don't have any, obviously, authority or like police authority, but having eyes out on the streets and having safety folks that aren't going to get involved, or like at least call 911 when something bad happens or is occurring, that's an interesting element of how people kind of band together. On the advocacy side, right, there are a lot of like AAPI and Jewish interest organizations that advocate for either funding or policy changes or anything like that that can help directly impact the problem that we're facing today. Feel free to join a organization or kind of learn or take upstander training, which is essentially just a form of how do you intervene, or I guess how do you approach a situation in which someone is spewing hate or there's something physical going on or all these other things. Like, what do you do when you react? And, this is kind of like stemming from like the bystander effect, where when you see something very scary or violent occurring, like a lot of people tend to freeze up, and those seconds do count. So taking one of those upstander trainings from any of the Asian interest organizations or the Jewish organizations is an interesting way to kind of get involved and learn about how these things approach. And honestly, I think the core thing really is that this is something for people who care, right? Like, it's people who understand and know that these things are wrong, and these are outlets for folks who want to get involved and aren't, I guess, thinking some of the stuff that is being spewed out nowadays, right? And how do you approach those sort of systems? And I think what comes down to is, if there's any policy proposals, like if, for example, in other states right now, there's funding for public information campaigns about like what the truths of, I guess, COVID or the pandemic or, like racial relations, all these things. There's ad campaigns that are going on, and a lot of people and folks in those areas, the elected officials' constituents call and say, hey, like, this is something that's really important to us. Like, if there is a policy proposal that you think can help directly impact how these conditions can be changed, that's a good way to also reach out and talk to your elected officials and say, like, hey, like, this is something I really care about, and this is something that I need, I want you to pay attention to as well. There's a lot of ways that we can go about this, either, fixing housing systems, services, having these kind of conversations, all these things. But this is something that's important to me as a constituent. So I think those are like primarily the three ways that you could get directly involved: looking for local organizations, looking for trainings or upstander trainings, bias trainings, all that stuff. And then also kind of advocating for policies that you think are positive and can really help impact the current state of hate crimes.
Yeah,
Did anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah,
Please,
and I think Lawrence did an excellent job of articulating it. I'll mention the two organizations that we deal with a lot. I'm not good about putting things in the chat, but there's an organization called Hollaback, HOLLABACK. You can just Google them. They are posting their free online trainings about they call it the 5 Ds of upstander training, bystander intervention training. Very helpful. I've taken their courses, and it really gives you the skills to know, like, when I'm on the subway and if I see somebody being harassed because of who they are, I know exactly what I'm going to do. And it's been really good. So that organization, also the Center for Anti-Violence Education, also providing excellent bystander intervention trainings. Listen, people, if you have children, nieces, nephews, if you're in the school system, how you speak to your kids when you see something that's not right, they will learn from that. If your schools are not teaching or you don't feel like there's enough cultural diversity, you need to be a voice for it. I think Lawrence is exactly right. There are a lot of organizations right now that need funding. I created a program called Partners Against the Hate that is now sending money into grassroots organizations to do hate violence prevention work. These groups need more money, so your voice is really important to tell your city council members you need to get the money into the grassroots to help sustain these organizations and build them. There's just so many levels. Just not being a bystander to the whole issue is really important. So every little piece helps. When you see the media, print an article that you think unfairly portrays, any of these groups, write a letter to the editor. Make your voice be known. You'd be amazed at how much power you actually can have when good people stand up to hate. It will make a difference.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of questions now from the chat. I'll read them out. I think this first one is to Daniel. This is from Jonathan Franklin. Is the previous presenter, and he wrote this earlier, suggesting that religious law always overrules secular law, and it continues elsewhere. I meant, does religion law overrule secular law?
Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting question, particularly about the United States. So I don't know where the questionnaire is coming from, but at least in the United States, religious communities have had access to civil courts for a long time to be able to arbitrate using religious law, particularly with family matters and inheritance and things like that. So we think about the Jewish community, we think about the Catholic community. And so I think in the United States, at least with our court system, not the criminal courts. So, and really a really interesting discussion, Emery, to have, if you want to kind of get into this more, would be to reach out to Esma Udine, who's really she's a lawyer, she's a scholar on religious liberty law in the United States. And I had her in my classroom in Zoom. And she really broke this down really well. So in civil courts with family inheritance and those types of things, religious communities have had access to the courts through that, and a judge would take religious law into consideration. And so what these state legislatures are trying to do, these state governments are trying to do, is say it was okay for the Jewish community, it was okay for the Catholic community to have access to those courts, but it's not okay for the Muslim community to have access to those courts, and therefore we are banning Sharia. And we were, in that case I had of Elham that Esma shared in the presentation she gave in my class, is a perfect example of how that ends up hurting this community and hurting the well-being of the residents of the state. So United States is a secular country, but it's interesting how there's a lot of overlap with religious communities. We're a religious society here. Yeah, more so than maybe other developed Western democracies.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got a question from Michelle Lawrence. She asks, what resources are available for anyone experiencing racial stress and racial trauma?
So
Deborah, are you able to take that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of city services, NYC Well provides free mental health support services. And there are a lot, if you're a victim of a hate crime, there are victim support services through the Office of Victim Support. There actually is a lot of good resources available. I would say also outreach to any of your advocacy organizations that may represent your community. They would have a good sense of what's there. I'll post in the chat just my general website for our office, and in there we do have a resource section that also links to support for victims, and it's in like 14 different languages as well. So that might be a helpful document for you. You're asking us what we think people should do to fight hate. I want to put a plug in. My office just is doing a new program, part of that path forward that I mentioned earlier, called Innovation Grants, where we're calling on individuals and community members. Come up, tell us what you think you can do, and apply for a grant for funding. The grants are going to be anywhere from probably $3,000 up to $20,000. And so if you have an idea of something you want to do, reach out to us. The application's on this website, and we've seen some really creative, interesting things come in already, and it's going to be on a rolling basis. So you too can help us come up. We don't have all the answers, so think about what might work for you and your communities.
Thank you, Deborah. Lawrence, did you want to add anything before the next question?
I would just add that the state last year, based on everything that was going on, we allocated a large amount of money, about 15 million, I think, to kind of start addressing various hate crime issues. And I think, one of the things that the advocacy organizations and constituents talked about the most was really that while there are some services available for victim assistance or all these other things, we kind of need more. We need more services in that area. And I think this is something that we want to keep working on as well. And I think that was a fantastic question. And I think it highlights the need that we have to kind of look at this as like both like a preventative and as like an active method of approaching these situations, because it's not like, by tomorrow or like next year even, or in the next month or so, all these hate crimes are suddenly going to stop, right? It's a slow moving process. And that's why you kind of have to look at it in every possible angle.
Okay, thank you for that. And just as a reminder for those that are watching, our audience members that are watching live, and those that are watching this later when it's on YouTube, we want to get this message as far as possible. So please hit that like button, subscribe, the usual things you usually hear on YouTube. And it's important for this message to get to a broader audience. And we've shared some links. So by all means, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and like, share, and retweet the messages there as well. The videos will be shared on those platforms. We've got another question now from another Jonathan. This is Jonathan Golden asks, one of the key fronts right now is in history, teaching history. How do we ensure that the realities of this nation's history with various forms of racism are taught?
Well, I think if you're talking about New York City, you're in good hands. The Department of Education is completely committed to, and the mayor has spoken about this, and the Chancellor Banks, the new chancellor for the Department of Education, is they do want these histories integrated. The challenges are going to be nationally. There's no doubt that you're not going to see, you've seen the pushback on critical race theory in many states. That's going to be a challenge for the more conservative states to get through. But in New York City, there's a real commitment from the top leadership through the Department of Education to make sure these histories are taught. The curriculum I mentioned earlier that my office is working on, specifically on hate crime, will definitely be addressing those histories, painful histories that need to be discussed, because we can't learn from them if we don't. So.
Did either of you, Daniel or Lawrence, like to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I think back in 2000, it was definitely before 2015. Lunar New Year was actually not a school holiday for a lot of people, and there's a lot of like small things inside of our education system, as well as just like in general, that a lot of people overlook. And I think that's one of the things that I would also like to highlight, is that, AAPI individuals historically have always been overlooked when it comes to equitable funding, when it comes to services, when it just comes even to representation in government. And that's sort of changing now. But, as we continue, working and doing all and progressing through time, I think it's important to really note that when you see something, or when you hear something, or when you feel like you notice something that isn't right, it's important to speak out about it, right? And I think that it's especially true for AAPI individuals, especially true for Jewish individuals, Muslim individuals, which are some of the most overlooked groups when it comes to government and governance in general. We're often it's often like, like government persecution, Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment camps, whatever it might be, or it's something where it's just like, well, we recognize that you exist, but we don't really do anything to actually like meet that need or address any of the concerns that you might have. And moving that sort of large machine requires a lot of people to be talking about it, and that's also one way that people can help out. If you see an article that you think is really positive or like kind of has a good message, share it. If you see something, like Deborah said, if you see something that's really negative and really horrible, send a letter to the editor, write a post about it. We live in a very different world than we did like even 5 years ago. And a simple tweet, a simple Facebook post or social media post or any of these things, a comment can actually make a really large, impactful difference. And you can contribute to how we approach this problem just by doing simple things of just as like sharing your opinion.
Thank you, Lawrence. And with that, we've come to the end of our event. I want to thank our speakers this evening. Thank you, Deborah, Daniel, and Lawrence. And I'm sorry that the Assembly member wasn't able to make it, but please send her our greetings. For those of you watching, of course, hitting the like button helps these videos on YouTube, and we'd like to think this message gets to many other places. So it should be shared. So please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Until next time, be well and safe, everyone. And again, thank you to our speakers.